Frost can be the bugbane of gardeners. It can ruin fruit and vegetable crops and, of course, flowers. To tell us all about the different types of frost and how we best avoid them, I talked to meteorologist Peter Gibbs. But first, we talked about climate change and how it affects gardeners. And it seems to me that with climate change, if you can be one step ahead of the weather, you're 90% there as a gardener. Now, climate change, how would you sum it up? It's affecting us, the world, and how do you think it's affecting gardeners, really?
Well, it's been interesting, buddy. The predictions for a long time, as far as the UK is concerned, coming out of models run by the Met Office, have suggested sort of over the long term, the trend with climate change would be towards warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. And, that's something that's been coming out of the models for at least the last 20 odd years. And I think we've got to the point now where people will probably agree, and I talk to a lot of gardeners who certainly nod along when I say this, that does seem to be the sort of thing that we're now seeing. And that's what's really bringing the challenges to gardeners. And, you obviously know as a horticulturalist, it's quite hard, isn't it, to recommend plants that are going to deal with those sort of conditions, particularly when it's swinging from one extreme to the other, like we've seen with flooding in winter over recent years, and then the sort of heat wave that we had this year, 40 degrees in the UK. Yeah, I never thought in my career as a meteorologist when I started that I'd ever see 40 degrees in the UK. So it's trying to, I suppose, give plants the best possible chance of getting through those extremes, because obviously in between those extremes, there's still going to be some reasonable conditions that they can actually deal with.
Interesting. But in one way, the milder winters do mean that we can grow a lot more than I could grow 30 years ago. Plumbagos, living outside, I would never have thought that. But then having said that, I think that's partially ignorance, because when we did a video on plumbagos, people that they regularly were frozen every winter and they came back. So,
know. Yes. Well, no, you're right. We are trying to get away with more things, aren't we? And at the moment, definitely are getting away with it. I always think of the exotic garden at Wisley that Matthew Pottage sort of introduced. And it's amazing the sort of stuff they're managing to grow in that. It looks incredible in summer, but at the moment, they're managing to get things through the winter. That said, we shouldn't get too carried away, because yes, overall, the trend is for things to get warmer and will be for quite some time to come. But that still doesn't rule out getting an occasional colder winter or a really nasty cold snap in the winter. It's not that long ago. You go back to sort of 2010 and we had some, and the sort of beast from the east stuff as well. And, we can still get that. It only needs a week or so of winds coming in from the Arctic or from the northeast, from the cold continental regions. And suddenly all those things you've been getting away with for the last several years are having a very hard time.
At minus 17 degrees.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, so I think one thing that confuses gardeners are frosts, because we have ground frosts, we have air frosts, and we have hoar frosts. And when our apples are coming into bloom and we get these sudden late frosts, we scream but can you just explain the difference between a ground frost and an air frost? It is literally that. One will be formed at the ground and one a metre above the ground.
Yeah, I mean that's basically it. It's really down to terminology, and it's down to the way that we measure air temperature as meteorologists as well. Because to standardise what you're actually measuring, so that you can put those numbers on a weather map or whatever, then the air temperature, the temperature of the air, is measured at a standard height above the ground. So those white louvered boxes, the Stevenson screen, keeps the sun out but lets the air blow through it. That's set at around about eye level. That's where the thermometers should be. So that's what we mean when we say an air temperature. So it's the temperature at that level in a screened container. When we say ground frost, so an air frost is when the temperature of that level reaches zero or below. And as you say, a ground frost is when the temperature on the ground reaches zero or below. I think what we need to take on board is that the ground temperature is pretty much always lower than the air temperature, that temperature measured at your sort of eye level. So
because hot air rises, basically.
well, it's actually because on a calm, clear night, it's the ground that cools down. It's actually the ground that's losing heat and then taking heat from the air above it. So it's not actually the air itself that's losing the heat out to space. It does a little bit, but not that much. It's actually the ground surface itself that's losing that heat out to space. And then that acts like the cold plate in the back of your refrigerator, if you like, and it's cooling the air then above it. So the coldness starts at the ground and works its way up. So you could easily get a difference 5, 6, 7 degrees between the temperature you're measuring at eye level on a calm, clear night in the winter and the temperature on the ground. So that's why you see, it can be absolutely enormous, depending on lots of factors like what type of soil you've got. If you're on sandy soil, for example, you get very little heat being conducted up from below overnight. Whereas if you're on a wet clay soil, there's always a little bit of heat just coming up from below to offset that cooling from the ground surface. So that comes into effect as well.
So sandy soils tend to have colder temperatures associated with them, you're saying?
Yes, they do.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And some of the coldest spots, particularly in England, are found in places where you have sandy soils, like in East Anglia, out in the Brecklands there. And you'll get enormous temperature differences between the air temperature and the ground temperature on a calm, clear night.
Right. And then the hoarfrost that we all love, and you see in magazines with icicles on echinacea and things like that.
Yeah.
So
that's basically a visible manifestation of the fact that the temperature on the ground, your ground frost, has fallen to zero. So it's simply the moisture in the air crystallizing out as ice crystals as the ground temperature falls to zero. So I know people that's where the confusion often comes in. You say ground frost and people think, it's when the ground's all white and frosty, isn't it? Actually, that's just the result of the temperature having fallen to zero on the ground. So the hoarfrost is just a nice pretty thing that results from having a ground frost. And we've got rime as well, which is the other one that looks fantastic when you've had a foggy night in the winter, freezing fog, and then you wake up and all the trees are covered. It's like somebody's painted icing sugar all over them. The trees and the bushes, all the sort of vertical surfaces are just encrusted with ice. That's a rime frost, and that comes from supercooled water droplets within a freezing fog hitting those surfaces and instantly freezing as they hit, and then it builds up into these lovely sort of flowery coverings on the trees and bushes, and it looks fantastic.
Oh, that's good. That's good to know. So then your tips you would give a gardener to help us battle all these things with climate change and the weather so we can grow better plants. What would you say? Your top 3 things or whatever?
It is hard. I must admit, it is hard to give really good advice that's going to get you through everything. But I think always at the top of my list is really get to know how the weather works in your garden, because even within a small garden, I think most people will be amazed at the differences in, it's what we call microclimate, of course, from one corner of the garden to another. In terms of temperature, in terms of rainfall, even in the tiniest of gardens, there will still be surprisingly large variations from one spot to the next. And that's why if you understand where the hottest place is likely to be in your garden, where the driest place is likely to be as a result of that, where the coolest spot is likely to be, then you've got a better chance of picking the right plants that are going to go in the right places to cope with those sort of conditions. Then hopefully that gives them a bit more resilience when we get the bigger swings, the bigger extremes. I mean, my garden here is a good example in that we face almost due south. The garden at the back of the house is very wide, but it's not very deep. So it's only about 5-6 meters from the back of the house here to the boundary fence. And even in that short distance, plants up against the house that are basically facing south. I've noticed with daffodils, for example, the same variety, some planted up near the house, some planted down near the fence, which of course is north facing. There'll be weeks difference in their flowering times in the spring. And that's over a distance of just 5 or 6 meters. That's how much difference it makes, because the bit nearer the house warms up so much more quickly in the spring.
Now, when you come to actually protecting your plants from frost, there are obviously ways and means now. We've got lovely things like fleeces, and you can get a 17 gram per square metre fleece, which is quite fine one, and that will protect you from 2 or 3 degrees of frost. And you can wash them in the washing machine, so you can use them again and again. Or you can get the thicker fleece, which I think is about 30 grams per square metre, and that will protect you from 6 degrees of frost. And obviously if you double them up, you get much more. So you can use all sorts of covers to protect it when it's going to be frosty, and it is really worth using your weather apps, finding out when it's going to be cold, and then you can cover them up when necessary. I mean, I always try and get my French beans or my runner beans or my courgettes out quite early in the spring, because I just watch the weather. I cover them when I need to, and that way they get their roots down before we have the summer droughts. So there's a few things to help you with actually changing and working with your particular microclimate in your garden. I'm not promising you'll never lose another plant to frost. We all gardeners like pushing our boundaries to the extremes, but that's what makes gardening exciting.